You are not who you think you are, at least not entirely by choice.
Hmm.
Now that's a pretty provocative way to start, I know. But it really gets to the core of what we're going to dig into
It
today.
really does.
Because in this modern age, our identity, that fundamental sense of who we are deep down, it isn't just something we sort of stumble upon through quiet thought or just living our lives.
Right.
No, it feels like it's increasingly constructed, it's curated like a social media profile, and maybe most unsettlingly, it feels like it can be imposed on us.
Yeah, imposed is a strong word, but maybe accurate in some ways.
It's like our sense of self has become this battleground for influence, shaped really profoundly by the stories and the narratives we consume constantly, often without even clicking that it's happening.
And that intersection is exactly where things get, well, both incredibly fascinating and, frankly, a little bit disturbing.
Mm.
We're going to explore how fields that seem quite separate, personality psychology, trying to figure out who are you really, alongside the often pretty dark history of propaganda studies and even the frankly chilling declassified stuff about psychological manipulation, how all these things actually converge.
They all meet at this point.
Precisely.
Yeah.
This deep dive is really going to show how the very mechanisms, the psychological processes that help form our sense of self can be, and often are, kind of hijacked, co-opted by outside forces.
It's a heavy thought, isn't it?
It is that the deepest parts of us, our unique personality, the story we tell ourselves about our life, might actually be in some significant way written by others, by systems, by intentions that aren't our own.
Yeah, it throws a wrench in the whole idea of free will, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So to really tackle this huge concept, we've gathered some really compelling source material. We're looking at rigorous university-backed psychological research, the studies on how personality develops, how we interact with the world. But then we're putting that right up against declassified government programs. Things like the infamous MKULTRA from the CIA, which, let's be blunt, aim to literally reshape minds.
It's quite a contrast.
It is. And we're also pulling in analyses from places like the RAND Corporation, looking at modern disinformation tactics, which are just... So our mission for you today, what we really want to do is unpack how our sense of who we are might be, in part, written by those trying to control us.
And critically.
And critically, yeah, what that actually means for your autonomy, for your ability to truly choose your own path. So let's start peeling back those layers. Let's try and understand the sort of silent architects of the self.
It's definitely a journey into the hidden currents that shape us all.
Okay, so let's start with what seems like a simple question, but it's actually incredibly deep, and it's right at the heart of personality psychology. Who are you, really?
The million-dollar question.
Exactly. For decades, psychologists have been wrestling with this, trying to map out human identity using different models. One of the most widely accepted frameworks, and probably one you've heard about, is the Big Five personality model.
Ocean, some people call it.
Right, Ocean. It breaks personality down into these 5 broad dimensions: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. How open are you to new things, how organized, how outgoing, how cooperative, how emotionally stable, basically.
And what's really fascinating there with those big 5 traits, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, is that while they feel like these sort of fixed parts of us, right? Like, I'm just an introverted person. The research paints a much more dynamic picture. Take openness, how imaginative or curious you are. Or conscientiousness, how disciplined, organized. Extroversion, outgoing, energetic. Agreeableness, compassionate, cooperative. And neuroticism, that tendency towards anxiety or emotional ups and downs. The work by researchers like Brent Roberts and Hee Yoon really emphasizes these are not static. They're not just set in stone at birth or in childhood.
So they change.
Profoundly developmental, yes.
Yeah.
They shift and evolve throughout our lives, sometimes subtly, sometimes more significantly. And they're influenced by, well, everything. Our environment's changing, the big relationships we form, just reflecting on things, the challenges we face, the successes. It all feeds back in.
Right.
And this simple fact alone really challenges that common myth, that kind of comforting idea that our self is just this fixed thing that never changes.
And it really makes you pause and think, doesn't it? Like, consider your own life for a second. How might your environment, the people you've known, places you've lived, maybe big life changes like a new career, or becoming a parent, or even facing a big setback, how might those things have subtly nudged parts of your personality over time? Maybe you found yourself becoming more conscientious after taking on more responsibility at work. or maybe more open to trying new things after traveling and seeing different ways of life. This idea that we're constantly actively developing, that our personalities are more adaptable than rigid. It's empowering, actually.
It is.
But as we're going to see, it also kind of opens a door, doesn't it, to external influence.
It absolutely does. Our personalities aren't like finished statues. They're more like ongoing construction projects,
Yeah.
constantly being shaped by the very fabric of how we live.
Okay, but here's where, for me anyway, it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because personality isn't just a list of traits, like ticking boxes.
No, far from it.
It's also fundamentally a story. Psychologists have really dug into this thing called narrative identity theory in recent decades.
It's a powerful concept.
And the idea is that we create meaning in our lives by building these internalized, evolving life stories. They're not just like a factual timeline of this happened, then that happened.
Not at all. They're interpretive.
Exactly, interpretive. We pick certain memories, we connect them, we shape them into these coherent arcs, right? Highlighting maybe moments of overcoming something or struggling or learning. These arcs, these personal stories, they give us a sense of purpose and, really importantly, a coherent identity. Like, you might see yourself as, I don't know, a survivor or a creator or someone who helps others. Those are narrative frames.
That's perfectly put. The research really shows that people don't just have experiences passively. We actively author them. We're the narrators of our own lives, shaping the raw stuff of events into meaningful plots. As Roberts and Yoon state, our self-concepts are essentially scaffolded by coherent life narratives that integrate the self across time.
Scaffolded, I like that word.
Yeah, it suggests structure, but also ongoing building. So identity is, at its heart, this deeply personal, ongoing storytelling project. And like any story, it's hugely shaped by context, right? The culture we're in, who we think the audience is, even if it's just ourselves, and the very language and ideas available to us to even tell that story.
Yeah.
How we frame our past, present, and future.
Yeah.
That becomes who we think we are.
But, and there's always a but, isn't there? This amazing human ability, building ourselves through stories, it also creates a huge vulnerability.
Explain that.
Well, think about it. If your identity is built from the stories and the narrative frameworks that are just available around you, then where those stories come from, what kind of stories they are, and just how much you're bombarded with them. That becomes critical.
Okay, yeah.
And in our world today, drenched in media, we're increasingly absorbing these little narrative fragments, not from, direct, messy, real-life experience or deep conversations, but from screens, from these simulations.
Simulations, like social media.
Exactly. Curated posts, news cycles pushing certain angles, algorithms feeding us content. They all offer these little snippets of identity, ways to belong, ways to see the world.
And you're saying these aren't just surface-level influences.
That's the point. These digital inputs, they don't just sway your mood for a minute or maybe influence what you buy. They seem to go deeper. They can shape the very architecture of yourself.
How so?
Well, imagine being constantly fed narratives about grievance, about how you're being wronged. Might that subtly shift your core belief about fairness, about society?
Right.
Or seeing an endless stream of curated perfection, might that warp how you see your own worth?
It makes sense. So if mass media, or maybe more deliberately psychological operators, people who really understand what makes us tick, if they learn how to strategically manipulate this identity-forming content.
Then they don't need to force you to do anything overtly.
Right. They don't need direct control. They just need to subtly, consistently tilt the narrative arc of yourself. They guide the stories you tell yourself about who you are, what matters, what's real. And by doing that,
They guide your choices
Yeah.
without you even noticing the strings.
exactly.
And the implications there are, well, they're kind of chilling, honestly. If who we are is partly a story, and if that story can be rewritten not by our own reflection, not by real growth, but by just relentless repetition of certain ideas or clever emotional manipulation hidden in content, or even, God forbid, messing with memory, then personality itself starts to look programmable.
Programmable, that's a heavy concept.
It is. It's not just about shaping opinions anymore. It's about reshaping the bedrock of who someone is, their core self, their purpose. This feels like the real psychological battleground of our time. It's a fight for your inner story.
And the crucial insight, I think, is that your identity is this dynamic narrative. And its authorship, that can be contested. It's not automatically yours. Hashtag tag 2. Propaganda is identity engineering.
Okay, so to really get our heads around how identity can be, well, engineered, we need to talk about propaganda. Now, for a lot of people, that word just instantly brings up images of, crude lies from authoritarian regimes, black and white films, obvious villains.
The old school stuff, yeah. State-controlled news pushing a really blatant line.
Exactly. But that view is dangerously simplistic, especially today. The reality is, well, it's way more sophisticated.
It really is. Propaganda, as thinkers like Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman described it so powerfully in Manufacturing Consent, is much more subtle and more pervasive. It's not just about shoving lies down people's throats.
Right. It's more like a filtering system.
Exactly, a sophisticated filtering system. It selects information, it frames it in certain ways, it amplifies specific messages, usually ones that support powerful interests. But crucially, it does all this while maintaining the illusion of a free press and open debate.
And they identified specific filters, didn't they? How this actually works in practice.
Yes, 5 key filters, especially relevant in democratic societies. First, there's the ownership of media. Big corporations owning news outlets. And surprise, surprise, they have their own interests.
Like maybe a media giant owning defense contractors isn't going to push super hard against military spending.
Precisely. Then there's advertising. Media needs ad revenue, right? So they might hesitate to run stories that upset major advertisers. Think about critical reporting on, say, the pharmaceutical industry if you rely heavily on their ads.
Makes sense. What's next?
Third is sourcing. Journalists often rely on official sources, government, corporate PR, because they're seen as credible and easy to access. But this gives those official sources huge power to shape the initial narrative.
Okay.
And fourth is flack. That's the negative backlash, the criticism, maybe even organized campaigns against media outlets or journalists who step outside the dominant narrative. It makes challenging the status quo potentially very costly, professionally and personally.
So it chills dissent.
Effectively, yes.
Yeah.
And finally, fifth, there are the dominant ideologies. Think about anti-communism during the Cold War as a classic example. Today, maybe it's certain unquestioned beliefs about free markets or national security. These underlying assumptions act like a filter, making some perspectives seem natural and others seem radical or unthinkable.
And the really key thing here, you're saying, is that it's not usually overt censorship, like a government deleting articles.
Not typically in the West, no. It's more about constructing a reality where certain viewpoints feel normal, obvious, widely shared, while alternative views just kind of disappear or they get framed as extreme, marginal, not worth considering seriously.
And this construction of reality, mediated reality, it has deep psychological effects, doesn't it? It goes way beyond just shaping our opinions on issue X or politician Y.
Absolutely. Connecting this back to personality theory, we're not just passive sponges soaking up information. We're active meaning makers, constantly trying to make sense of things.
Right, we interpret.
We interpret. And our sense of self is formed through this ongoing process of selectively internalizing stuff, both our direct experiences and what we get from media, especially when that media input is constant, when it's emotionally charged, or when it directly speaks to our identity, stories about us versus them, or things that affirm our core values.
So the big takeaway here is,
The vital takeaway is, media doesn't just inform you about the world out there. It actively helps form you. It contributes to the very fabric of who you think you are and how you see your place in that world.
that's a huge distinction, moving from just being informed to actually being formed. And it really sets the stage for understanding modern disinformation, which seems to have taken these principles and just cranked them up to 11.
Oh, absolutely. The RAND Corporation's research, particularly their model describing modern Russian propaganda tactics, they call it the fire hose of falsehood, really illustrates this shift.
The fire hose of falsehood, what does that mean?
It highlights how modern propaganda often relies on sheer volume, incredible velocity, and a huge variety of messages, often contradictory ones, to simply overwhelm our ability to think critically.
So it's not about one convincing lie anymore.
Not necessarily. It's more like being hit with 1,000 different claims, fast, from all directions, many of them emotionally loaded, some true, some false, some half-true. Paul and Matthews from RAND argue these campaigns often work, not by making you believe one specific story is true, but by flooding the zone so much that any counter-narrative, any attempt at rational correction just gets drowned out. It loses its power.
Wow. So truth dies by drowning, not by direct attack.
In a sense, yes. And in that kind of overwhelming environment, simple repetition, regardless of whether something is true or not, no matter how wild it sounds, at first becomes a primary way beliefs are formed.
Just hearing it over and over again.
Exactly. It's a known cognitive bias called the illusory truth effect. Repeated statements start to feel more true than new ones just because they're familiar. Familiarity starts to feel like truth. You hear the sky is green enough times from enough different angles, even knowing it's blue, that repetition makes the false claim feel somehow more plausible over time, less jarring.
That's genuinely unnerving. Just pause and think about your own online life for a moment. How many times do you hear certain catchphrases or buzzwords or these big overarching narratives repeated across different websites from different people, maybe even people you follow who seem unconnected? How might that relentless echoing, whether it's factual or not, be subtly shaping your gut feeling about reality, your beliefs about the world, your place in it?
Mm-hmm. It's a constant subconscious drip, drip, drip.
Yeah, a relentless echo chamber almost.
And this connects directly back to narrative identity in a really chilling way. When propaganda isn't just pushing facts or opinions, but offers these emotionally powerful stories, stories tapping into deep fears or hopes or maybe resentments, people can unconsciously absorb these narratives and weave them into their own inner story, into their self-concept.
So you start telling yourself a story that originated somewhere else.
Potentially, yes. Over time, your sense of self gets scaffolded, built up, not just by your own lived experiences, but by these secondhand ideological frames. These frames come embedded in the news you consume, the social media algorithms feeding you content, the political rhetoric you hear constantly.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine someone who's naturally high on the personality trait of neuroticism, meaning they're prone to anxiety, maybe worry a lot. If they're constantly exposed to fear-driven media narratives about crime waves or economic disaster or existential threats, they might start to internalize a worldview of constant danger and impending doom.
So it feeds their existing tendencies.
Exactly, but it goes further. It doesn't just bend their view of the world, it can actually reshape their self-perception. They might start seeing themselves primarily as, say, a person under siege, someone constantly battling threats, maybe feeling perpetually vulnerable, but also maybe perpetually righteous in their vigilance. The story they tell about themselves changes.
And what's really weird and kind of counterintuitive is that this modern stuff doesn't even need to be consistent, does it?
No, that's a key difference. We tend to think, well, if it contradicts itself, people will see through it.
Right, logical inconsistency should break the spell.
That's the old model, maybe, where propaganda tried to persuade with a coherent, even if distorted, argument. The fire hose model shows something different. Contradictory messages can actually coexist. They can even reinforce each other in the short term, strangely enough.
How? Why doesn't our brain just reject the contradiction?
The key seems to be overwhelming the individual. Cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable feeling when you hold conflicting beliefs, it gets drowned out by sheer cognitive fatigue. Imagine trying to logically dissect 1,000 conflicting, screaming headlines every day. Your brain just, it's exhausted.
Information overload.
Precisely. When people are hit with that relentless barrage, they tend to default to what feels right emotionally, rather than what holds up logically.
Yeah.
If a message resonates with their existing feelings, their fears, their hopes, they might accept it, even if it directly contradicts something else they believe. Paula Matthews stated very clearly, disinformation does not need to be consistent, only persistent.
Persistent, not consistent, wow.
The goal isn't necessarily logical belief. It's often about creating a powerful, maybe even contradictory feeling of truth. An emotional reality.
Okay, so let's process this. What does all this mean for us, for our sense of self? We said identity is built from stories, beliefs, memories, goals. But if those stories are being fed to us through this chaotic, overwhelming, emotionally manipulative fire hose, then our identity becomes incredibly vulnerable, not just to lies, but to engineered chaos, this turbulence of meaning where we're desperately trying to grab onto something to make sense of who we are. And if you can't really trace where your core beliefs came from, if they're just echoes from this persistent noise, can you really say they're yours? Did you author your own story, or was it kind of whispered or maybe screamed into existence by someone else?
And that leads to the really profound shift we're seeing. Media, which ideally might reflect reality or offer diverse perspectives, increasingly becomes like a pen, actively writing our inner narratives with every algorithmically chosen piece of content.
So propaganda stops being just about controlling what people think about an issue.
And becomes about shaping who they think they are, their very identity. And once you hijack that core identity, once the self is subtly rewritten, then overt control, forcing people to behave a certain way, often becomes unnecessary.
Because they'll act on their own.
They'll act in perfect alignment with the script they've unknowingly absorbed, believing completely that these are their own choices, their own values, their own free will in action.
The crucial insight here feels like When external forces shape the story you tell about yourself, they gain immense control over your actions, often completely beneath your radar. Okay, the phrase mind control. It immediately makes you think of like cheesy sci-fi movies, right? Dark labs, maybe cult leaders with spooky powers, shadowy government plots.
Yeah, it sounds like pure fiction, designed to thrill or scare.
Totally. But here's where it gets really interesting and honestly pretty disturbing. Because the truth is, the history, particularly of Western intelligence agencies like the CIA, shows that experiments in this area were far from fiction.
No, they were very real.
They were funded, they were documented, and eventually parts of it were admitted publicly. Behind all the Cold War paranoia and the strategic thinking, there was this deeper, much more chilling ambition, not just to sway opinions, but to try and actually own the mind itself, to essentially program a human being.
That's absolutely right. The lid was blown off, at least partly, back in 1977. Remember the Church Committee hearings in the U.S. Senate? They publicly exposed fragments of these programs. MKULTRA, the most notorious umbrella project. It was a huge CIA initiative explicitly aimed at developing ways to control behavior in psychology. And the methods they explored were, frankly, terrifying. Psychoactive drugs, LSD being the most famous, but many others too, hypnosis, electroshock therapy, extreme sensory deprivation, isolation.
And the subjects, who are they experimenting on?
That's one of the darkest parts. Declassified records confirmed they experimented often without any informed consent. On prisoners, on patients in mental institutions, on military personnel, even on unsuspecting civilians. Ordinary people given drugs without their knowledge.
It's horrifying.
And the stated goal wasn't subtle. It was explicitly about finding ways to create programmable human beings, individuals whose actions, whose will, could be directed externally, maybe without them even knowing or remembering it later.
The ethical void there is just staggering, complete disregard for dignity. W.H. Bowert, in his book Operation Mind Control, he goes deeper into the objective, right? It wasn't just about getting intel or breaking someone in interrogation.
No, the ambition was much larger. Personality reconstruction. Bowert documented cases suggesting the goal was to use trauma, deliberately induced trauma, combined with drugs and manipulation, to actually fragment an individual's personality.
Fragment it, like creating multiple personalities.
Essentially, yes. Creating what the programs chillingly called alters, dissociated subpersonalities. The idea was these alters could then be trained, given specific programming or commands, and then triggered later, acting independently of the person's core identity. Imagine inducing severe trauma, using drugs like LSD to make someone highly suggestible, and then trying to implant new beliefs or commands into those broken-off parts of the psyche.
It sounds like something from a horror film, but you're saying this was a documented goal.
The documentation points towards these kinds of ambitions, yes. And what's disturbing is how this methodology, in a twisted way, mirrors some clinical understandings of how severe, prolonged trauma can lead to dissociation and identity fragmentation, like in dissociative identity disorder.
But instead of healing it,
They sought to weaponize it, to use dissociation, memory repression, compartmentalization not as symptoms of damage, but as tools for control. The drugs were key. LSD to break down defenses, barbiturates maybe to suppress memory or anxiety, amphetamines to stimulate certain patterns, scopolamine, the so-called truth serum, to induce disorientation and potentially implant or erase memories.
it's psychology turned completely on its head.
Exactly. Peter Schrag warned about this back in '78 in his book Mind Control. He said the real danger was philosophical. The very techniques once developed to understand human freedom are being used to undermine it. Psychology in these dark corners crossed a terrifying line from observing the self to actively trying to dismantle and rebuild it.
So when we talk about neural slavery in this context, it's not just a dramatic phrase.
I don't think it's hyperbole, no.
Yeah.
In the mindset driving these programs, the human being was essentially redefined, not as a whole autonomous person, but as a kind of machine, a modular system.
Like parts you could swap out.
Traits, memories, behaviors seen as components that could be altered chemically, electrically, maybe symbolically through hypnosis. Personality wasn't sacred. It was input, output, open to reprogramming. Identity became a technology, something you could update, erase, weaponize, and ultimately control from the outside.
And connecting this back to narrative identity. If our identity is the story we tell ourselves.
Then these trauma-based programs aim to literally rip that story apart, sever the narrative thread, create amnesia, fragmentation, blank slates, or disconnected chapters within a person's life story.
Allowing new stories, new commands to be inserted.
That seems to have been the goal. In clinical trauma, this fragmentation leads to disorders, immense suffering. In these covert operations, the aim was obedience without awareness, belief without genuine conviction, action without real consent.
What's maybe the most terrifying part of this, though? Is it just a dark chapter in history, or does it still echo?
Well, that's the truly chilling question. How many techniques refined in those secret labs have subtly filtered into mass culture, often in diluted but maybe still powerful forms?
Like what?
Think about it. Sleep deprivation common in modern life. Sensory overload, just look at our media landscape. Rapid emotional shifts, news cycles, social media feeds are designed for this. Constant contradictory messaging, we just talked about the fire hose of falsehood. These weren't just tools in CIA labs decades ago to plunk people down. They are, in various ways, features of modern advertising, social media engagement tactics, political rhetoric.
So the line between deliberate mind control experiments and just modern life gets blurry.
It gets uncomfortably blurry. As Boert argued, the ultimate danger isn't just the technology itself, but the underlying intention and society's willingness to accept it. When a society starts tolerating identity manipulation, whether it's by secret agencies for control or by sophisticated marketing algorithms for profit, it risks losing its ethical anchor, its commitment to the idea that the self should be autonomous.
So neural slavery isn't just a historical artifact. It's a concept that remains relevant. It exists on a spectrum, perhaps. And in its various forms, it's scalable, and it poses an ongoing threat to freedom, potentially reducing it to just a feeling, a fragile illusion we cling to.
The crucial insight may be being, the methods once used in secret labs to break down identity now echo disturbingly in the ways our everyday digital world engages and shapes us. Okay, so if MKULTRA and those kinds of programs represent the dark, secret past of trying to control minds,
Clandestine era, yeah.
then the algorithms driving today's digital world feel like the evolutionary future of that same impulse, just maybe slicker, more integrated.
That's a powerful way to put it.
It feels like that kind of covert experimentation hasn't just vanished, it's maybe been outsourced to machines, disguised as convenience or entertainment, normalized, seamlessly woven into how we live. What used to take chemicals or coercion in some hidden lab.
Is now being done through likes, swipes, filters, personalized feeds, and the results might be just as transformative to who we are, maybe even more so because it's so subtle, so constant, and so incredibly personalized.
And we saw a shocking example of this potential weaponization come out not from a government, but from a private company, Cambridge Analytica.
Right. That was huge news.
Huge. Their actions revealed how they harvested Facebook data from millions, mostly without real consent, to build what they literally called an information warfare toolkit.
Informational warfare, using personal data.
Exactly. The aim was to create incredibly detailed psychographic profiles. And guess what they based them on?
Let me guess. The big 5 personality traits.
Go. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. They profiled millions based on these traits, inferred from their online activity, and then they used those profiles to micro-target political messages, tailoring ads with chilling precision to exploit each person's specific cognitive vulnerabilities and psychological makeup.
Okay, can you break that down? Give us some concrete examples of how they weaponize personality like that.
Absolutely. The details are really quite stark. For instance, users whose profiles indicated they were high in neuroticism, more prone to anxiety, worry, instability.
Okay.
They would be bombarded with fear-based advertising. Messages designed to trigger anxiety may be about crime or economic insecurity or outsiders or social chaos. The goal was to amplify their existing fears and push them towards a political choice based on a perceived need for security or order.
Wow. And what about other traits?
Conversely, users identified as high in openness, people who are generally more curious, imaginative, receptive to new ideas,
Right.
they were fed messages appealing to that trait. Messages about change, disruption, maybe even revolution. Things framed as exciting, new, breaking from the old ways. See. Personality itself became the target. It became a weaponized data set.
So political reality wasn't shared anymore. It was like a personalized hallucination.
That's a good way to describe it. Engineered for each person's psyche to get a specific reaction, push a specific belief.
Okay, but how does this actually work psychologically? How do these algorithms get so good at understanding us? Sometimes it feels like they know us better than we know ourselves.
Well, the scary thing is, the psychological foundation is pretty solid and well understood. We mentioned Roberts and Yoon earlier, their work, and others, shows that our personality traits are deeply tied to our basic motivational systems. What drives us?
Okay.
For example, Someone highly conscientious is often motivated by order, duty, achievement. Someone highly extroverted is motivated by social interaction, excitement, external rewards. Algorithms learn these deep patterns. How? By watching everything we do online.
Every click, every pause.
Every click, how long you watch a video, what you like, share, comment on, even how fast you scroll past something versus pausing. It's incredibly granular data collection happening constantly in real time. The algorithms crunch this data and build a model of your underlying psychological tendencies.
And once they have that model,
Then they start reinforcing it. They feed you content they predict you'll engage with based on that personality profile. This creates a powerful, often completely invisible feedback loop.
how does the loop work?
Every time you interact, click, watch, like you give the algorithm more data, refining its model of you. In response, it serves you even more content aligned with that model. Over time, this doesn't just confirm your existing biases, it actively sculpts your identity. It gently, persistently nudges you down paths. It knows you're psychologically inclined towards, shaping your beliefs, your tastes, maybe even your core sense of self.
Which leads to this really weird paradox in modern life, doesn't it?
What do you mean?
We're constantly told we're free. Be yourself, express your unique identity. We feel free. We feel like we're making choices.
Right. The subjective feeling of freedom is strong.
But underneath, these invisible systems are operating, systems that, frankly, seem to understand our psychological triggers and vulnerabilities better than we do ourselves, and they're using that understanding to shape us.
That's the core warning from thinkers like Yuval Noah Harari. He put it something like, when a system understands you better than you understand yourself, it can predict and manipulate your desires more effectively than you can resist them.
That's chilling. And this predictive power, it's not just about selling us shoes, is it?
No, it goes much deeper. It's about what you could call narrative colonization, your sense of who you are, what you want, what you believe is true, what you value. It risks becoming an output of a system you didn't design, you don't control, and often you don't even fully perceive. Your inner compass gets calibrated externally.
And the key to making this work so well is the illusion of agency.
Absolutely crucial. Unlike the brute force methods of MKULTRA, no isolation needed, no drugs, no overt trauma. The system just observes you, builds its model, and then feeds you this perfectly customized stream of content. Content designed to reinforce certain aspects of your identity, push you subtly in certain directions.
So you end up believing that your political views or your taste in music or your worries about the future, they all just bubbled up naturally from inside you.
Exactly. You feel like they came from your own authentic reflection, your own experiences. When in reality, they may have been carefully curated, algorithmically reinforced over potentially years of subtle, continuous influence. The feeling of making your own choices is preserved, while the actual influence stays hidden, like a ghostwriter for your own thoughts.
And this must be particularly dangerous for younger people, right? Teenagers, young adults who are still actively figuring out who they are.
Hugely so. They're in the most critical stages of building their narrative identity, actively searching for cues, for belonging, for meaning. And as they scroll through these endless feeds, absorbing conflicting values, idealized images, hyperpolarized arguments that self they construct, it might end up reflecting the logic of the machine more than their own unique inner voice.
You could almost call them code-born, not literally, but psychologically.
It's a striking term, code-born. Their psychological architecture is being shaped, perhaps fundamentally, by the algorithms that are, in effect, raising them in this digital environment. Their identity isn't just influenced by it, it's intricately woven with it.
So the whole battlefield has shifted. It's not the secret lab anymore.
No, it's the screen in your pocket. It's your feed. It's the personalized news you get. The tools aren't drugs and electrodes. They're engagement metrics, personality scores derived from your data, automated recommendation engines.
And the war isn't happening in some deep, repressed part of the mind.
It's happening right there in your conscious awareness, in the reflection of yourself you see mirrored back. In the stories you think you wrote about yourself, but which you might have just unknowingly echoed, amplified, and adopted from an external script provided by the machine.
The crucial insight feels like the drive for algorithmic engagement has unintentionally created the most widespread, scalable system of psychological influence ever known, turning our very identities into something that can be profiled and potentially manipulated.
Okay, so if we take this unsettling idea seriously, that our minds are, well, somewhat programmable, that our identities can be subtly steered or even hijacked.
It's a lot to absorb.
It is. Then the big question becomes, how do we fight back? How do we resist this kind of programming, especially when it tries to define us without our okay? And reclaiming our autonomy, living freely in this age of, well, we've called it neural slavery. It's clearly not passive. It's not simple.
No, it requires real effort.
It seemed like it needs active awareness, some kind of psychological discipline, and maybe a really radical reclaiming of our own story, our own authorship.
Yeah.
But the good news, and I think there is good news, is that resistance is possible and maybe more necessary than ever.
Absolutely. And the first step, the absolute foundation of any resistance, is simply awareness, just knowing this is happening.
Seeing the matrix, so to speak. Kind of, yeah. Peter Schrag warned about this decades ago, and it feels incredibly relevant now. He basically said, don't assume only dictatorships use coercion. A society that thinks it's totally free is actually the most vulnerable to manipulation because it stops looking for it.
Because we let our guard down.
Exactly. Modern propaganda, algorithmic influence, they work best when they're invisible. When you don't even realize you're being targeted or shaped. The moment you become conscious of these mechanisms, you start asking, wait, how is my data being used? How are these stories being filtered to me? How might my identity be shaped by these forces? Just asking those questions starts to give you back some interpretive power.
So media literacy isn't just for school kids.
No, it becomes like essential spiritual armor for your mind in the 21st century.
Right.
It helps you see when the pen writing your story might not actually be in your hand.
Okay, so step one, wake up, pay attention. But what about actual practical steps? What can you, listening right now, do beyond just being aware? How do you actually push back?
That leads to the second act. Actively disrupting the narratives you've internalized. We know from psychologists like Brent Roberts that identity isn't fixed. It's plastic. It's a work in progress.
Right, we established that earlier.
Which means you have the power to consciously challenge your own scripts. The stories you tell yourself about yourself and the world. How? Well, things like consistent journaling, actually writing down your thoughts, feelings, the narratives playing in your head, that can be a powerful way to step back and re-author things.
Seeing it written down makes it objective somehow.
It can, yes. Therapy obviously provides a space to identify and revise narratives that aren't serving you. But even just the intentional practice of storytelling about your own life, choosing consciously how you frame your experiences, focusing on resilience or learning instead of victimhood, perhaps that becomes a revolutionary act of self-creation.
And the key question to keep asking is,
Whose story am I living right now? Is this really my voice, or is it an echo? And that's not just philosophy. In a world saturated with external narratives, asking that question becomes a vital survival skill. It's about self-ownership.
what about our connections with other people? It feels like propaganda and algorithms often try to isolate us, put us in bubbles.
They absolutely thrive on isolation, yes. Propaganda often works by creating specific realities for different groups, feeding them different info streams. And algorithms excel at creating these tight filter bubbles where everyone seems to agree with you, which distorts your sense of reality and can seriously erode empathy for people outside your bubble.
So what's the antidote to that digital isolation?
Real human connection. Genuine, shared, grounded conversation. Preferably face-to-face or at least in intentional groups where you can really hear and respond to another complex human being, not just an avatar. W.H. Boert said something profound about this, arguing against mind control. The antidote to control is community, for it is in relationship that the human mind remembers itself.
That's beautiful. The mind remembers itself in relationship.
Isn't it? So open dialogue, especially across differences, grounded in shared humanity, not just ideological talking points, that becomes a powerful healing force against the fragmentation these systems encourage. It's about consciously seeking out different perspectives and engaging respectfully, remembering we're more than the algorithm thinks we are.
That makes a lot of sense. And it feels like there's maybe a deeper, quieter kind of resistance to something internal.
I think so. It's about returning to, or perhaps discovering, a way of living based on enduring values, rather than the values the system constantly pushes on us.
Like what?
Well, think about what the digital world often incentivizes. Outrage, speed, constant consumption, performative conflict. The counterforce might be things like humility, choosing slowness, cultivating silence, and a deep commitment to truthfulness, both with others and ourselves.
So opting out of the noise.
In a way, yes. Consciously choosing not to engage in the endless dopamine-fueled cycles. Deliberately stepping outside the structures designed to capture your attention and shape your identity. Just deciding to slow down. To listen more deeply to other people, yes, but also to your own body. To that quiet inner voice that gets drowned out so easily. That act of cultivating presence becomes a form of resistance against the machinery of neural slavery. It's about building an inner sanctuary that external noise can't easily breach.
And this resistance, this reclaiming, it's not just about protecting yourself, is it? There's a broader dimension.
Absolutely. Responsibility extends beyond just shoring up your own defenses. Those of us who start to see these patterns, who recognize the manipulation, we have a kind of duty, I think, to gently help educate others, to share what we're learning.
Lifting the veil for others.
Exactly. Because propaganda, manipulation, they thrive when truth is fragmented, when people feel isolated, when those who see clearly stay silent. Speaking truth about these mechanisms, even when it's uncomfortable or complex, is itself an act of liberation for you and for the community.
So the battle isn't won by building higher walls around ourselves.
No, it's won through inner resilience, yes, but also through shared wisdom, collective understanding, and a commitment to integrity, being truthful in how we construct ourselves and interact with the world. The tools of influence we've discussed are incredibly powerful, no doubt, but they're not absolute. As long as there is awareness, there is still choice.
And as long as there is choice.
The soul cannot be owned. Hashtag tag tag outro.
Wow. So we've really covered some ground today exploring this profound and, let's be honest, pretty unnerving idea that maybe the greatest illusion in modern life is feeling free just because we feel free. But what we've seen, digging into the research and the history, is that beneath the surface of our thoughts or feelings or very sense of who we are, these incredibly complex systems are constantly at work, quietly, persistently reshaping what we encounter, how we react, and ultimately who we believe ourselves to be. It's like a subtle, ongoing engineering of the self.
And this deep dive really showed how different fields, personality, psychology, propaganda studies, the history of mind control, they all kind of converge on this one. Quite disturbing truth. The self is programmable, or at least far more malleable than we might like to think.
Yeah.
From understanding identity as a narrative we construct, to the chilling goals of MKULTRA, from Chomsky's filters shaping the news to the overwhelming fire hose of falsehood, from Cambridge Analytica weaponizing personality traits to the everyday feedback loops of social media, every layer we peeled back seemed to reveal another way. Our autonomy, our sovereignty over our own minds can be subtly eroded.
The self, once considered maybe sacred or at least private, now feels like it's floating in this constant stream of influence, where even our attempts to resist can sometimes be predicted, packaged, and sold back to us.
It's a dizzying thought.
It is, and yet, as we spent the last section discussing, awareness really does start to break the spell. The moment you genuinely start to ask yourself, with real curiosity, maybe even a bit of defiance, wait, whose story am I living right now? Who's actually holding the pen? That's the moment you begin to reclaim authorship.
The beginning of taking back control.
Exactly. So living freely, truly freely, in this age of potential neural slavery. It might not be about escaping influence entirely. That might be impossible now. But maybe it's about recognizing it's there, consciously disrupting its rhythm when we can, and making a deliberate choice again and again to tell a different story.
Yeah.
A story rooted not in the fear or the programming being pushed on us, but in something more authentic, in truth maybe, in genuine connection with others, in deliberate conscious authorship of our own lives.
Because in the end, freedom is not a setting on the machine. It is a refusal to be defined by it.